So I recently made this video where I broke down the Lumino style, but I mainly focus on the 2D aspect of it. In this video, I want to focus more on the 3D aspect of those type of animations, kind of similar to the Lumino, but also the Fern, Neo, and Imperial kind of style. But before we get too far into it, I just want to say a quick thank you to today's video sponsor, Skillshare, but more on them later on. Now, before we can actually get into the animation itself, we need to understand the essence of those animations. See, they're all super simple, but executed really well, which is why it's so important. The 3D scenes rarely have any animation to them outside of just camera movement and focus shifts, which makes it so much more important that we absolutely nail composition, lighting, and models. Assuming we have story and script in place, the next focus is models. There are a few different places I like to look for my 3D models. Most of these places have a bunch of free options, which is why I like using them a whole bunch. And my go-to places are Polyhaven, CG Trader, Turbo Squid, Sketchfab, Free 3D, and Blender Kit, which is a plugin that you can get for Blender where you don't even have to browse the internet at all. You can just get them straight into your project file. You can do that with Polyhaven as well, but it does require that you subscribe to their Patreon. Speaking of patrons, if you are interested in this project file that we're going to be working on today, then feel free to head down in the description where you can go to my Patreon and get those project files at patreon.com/Mapal. The models that you'll need will obviously vary from project to project, but just make sure that you keep the rights in check so that you know if you're actually allowed to use them the way that you are going to use them. Otherwise, sometimes you will have to pay just a little bit to assure that so you don't get you or your client in trouble. Now, inside of Blender, I just have this standard project open, just a general, nothing fancy. I just saved it so that, you know, just in case we have a copy of it. But the first thing we're going to do is hit A, which is just going to let us select everything, and then I'm going to hit X to delete everything and get rid of it, because we just want to start with a blank canvas. Now, before we get too carried away in Blender, I want to talk a little bit about today's video sponsor, Skillshare. If you watch any of the previous 3D tutorials, you'll know that everything that I know about Blender and 3D I've learned from Skillshare. More specifically, this learning path by Elliot. So if you aren't too comfortable in Blender yet, I highly recommend using my link to go and get 1 month free where you can start playing around with Blender and really get a good hang of it, because it's a super useful tool, even if you are just a 2D animator or an editor. However, that's not all. See, Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, which means that they have pretty much anything you can think of. They don't only have 3D stuff, you can even learn marketing, branding, you can do motion design, photography, cooking, anything you can think of, you can learn on Skillshare. Every single class is taught by industry professionals, so you know no matter what, you are in good hands, and whatever you learn will actually be applicable in the real world. Take advantage of any extra time you might have over the summer and learn something new, or even just sharpen your tool set just a little bit. Personally, my goal for the summer is to take a couple of classes taught by Jeff Staples. You might already know him if you're into streetwear, but essentially he started a brand and he has some really cool classes on t-shirt manufacturing, branding, marketing, pretty much anything that goes into creating a brand that actually will succeed in the real world. The summer is the perfect time for me to do it. Just you have a lot more holidays, a lot more time off where you can really dig deep and dive into it so that you set yourself up for a more successful Q3 and Q4. If you're wanting to do the same, sharpen your tool set, learn something new, then head to the link in the description where the first 500 people to sign up will get 1 month free of Skillshare. But with that being said, let's hop straight back into Blender. Now, before we add our models, I just want to set up our scene a little bit. The first thing I'll go is into the render properties, and I like to change it to a cycles from an Eevee workflow, just because the shadows are a little bit more realistic. I like the lighting of it, and I think it works really well for the type of style that we're trying to go for. I'm going to change the feature set to experimental and device to GPU compute. All of these settings might vary just a little bit depending on your computer and its strong suits and all that stuff, but this typically works pretty well for me. And I'm gonna decrease the max samples a whole bunch, and I'm only doing that for the viewport so that whenever we pre-render something in here, we don't render a whole bunch of instances. It's just gonna let us see it a little bit quicker, and it's not really necessary to go full on. For the max samples of the render, I am gonna increase it. I'll typically stop at something like 300, and then you can always play around with it later on. But for now, we're not gonna worry too much about that. I also like to save a lot of times whenever I'm working in Blender, just because sometimes it can crash. You never know, you might tweak a setting that adds 1,000 hair follicles and then you don't want it to crash on you. So save a lot. The next thing is to go into the output properties. Here you can set your frame rate and all that stuff, I like to set it to 23.98, which is just a standard kind of frame rate you use over here in America. If you're in Europe, you want to use 25 frames per second. So it just kind of depends on what footage you're working with, but keep that in mind because it just makes it a little bit easier so you don't have mismatched frame rates. The resolution, you can just keep a 1920 by now. You can even set it lower, you can set it higher. It doesn't matter too much. You can always change it in the end. And then we have the duration, which is just how long do you want your little sequence to be, and this will vary a whole bunch. I think 250 is going to work fine for what we are trying to do today. We will play with the output a little bit later when we get towards the rendering of it, but for now we can just leave it right where it is. With that out of the way, let's get to setting up our scene. The first thing we're going to do is add some models. I'm going to use the Blender Kit plugin that I have up here, and you can see it's just a nice little neat tucked away little thing, but you can search for pretty much anything that you want. So in this case, we need a sort of a scene, so maybe like a castle. And the great thing about this is they have pretty much anything that you could possibly ever imagine. And I like going over into this filter and say free first, just because, you know, most of the time I do like working with free stuff. But then you can go in and you can search for things. You can even go into filters and architecture and subcategories. They have pretty much legitimately anything. Some of them are paid, of course, so you'll have to keep that in mind. But let's go into some buildings. Maybe some historic buildings. I think that would work pretty well. And we might even just delete our search here just so we see everything that they have. And I like this little preview that they show here. Maybe we'll do this little old city building. I think that might look pretty cool. And all you do is just click and instantly you have it in your scene. Super smooth, super neat. The next thing we gotta add to this is some characters. And that's where it kind of gets fun because a lot of the style itself is super reliant on the scene that you're in. You always see these cool castles, medieval buildings, these characters. So I think for now, what I'm gonna do actually is just search for another person. Now I'm gonna go out of the subcategory up here because we don't need that anymore. And we can just go into characters maybe. So open that up. So I just searched for lady and I see they have a few really cool low poly models here, which kind of fits the style super perfectly because if you've seen any of them, you know, it's all basically just like little clay models almost. Some of them have like a metallic or like a one color, but it's never detailed models. So I think this will work really well. So maybe we'll do this lady that looks like she's taking a selfie and it adds it down here in the center of our composition. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna click on our lady. As you can see, she's down here. I'm gonna hit G and that's just gonna enable the position, but then we're just gonna hit Z to bring her up first so we see where she's at. And then click, left click, and then G again, and then Y to bring her out here. And then we can take her down. And this step is super important. You want to make sure that your characters are in a position that makes sense. So you want to make sure they have good ground contact. You want to basically make sure scale is good and all that stuff, but we can always tweak that, but it's super important to keep in mind. Now let's take her down by hitting G again and then Z so we can bring her down into the floor. And we'll just see when she starts making contact with that. And right about there looks pretty good. And maybe just a little bit more up like that. Because we don't want her floating. Just the tiniest bit of peeking might be fine, but we definitely don't want her floating. Now my idea for this is probably a scene that kind of looks from this angle. So it's not gonna be too important because her feet are covered up, but you never know what angles you might need. Now we can search for a man maybe to put next to her and see what they've got up here. Now I think this guy is gonna work super well. Again, it's kind of the similar style. It even looks like the same artist as well. So we're gonna click that, bring him into our scene, make sure we have him selected, hit G and Z to bring him up, and G and Y to bring him out here so that we can have him standing next to each other. Now we do need to bring him down a little bit because we don't have the ground contact fully in place. We've got him here and they look to be pretty proportionate in scale. You know, usually men are a little bit taller, so that works pretty fine. We can hit G, X to bring him out here, and G and Y to bring him back a little bit. Maybe G and X a little bit more. And then we're just gonna make sure that he is actually above the floor over here as well. We can hit R and Z to rotate him to make him look like he's facing towards our woman a little bit. So maybe almost want her to stand out by the edge so we can bring her out just a little bit more this way. And then having him lurk kind of behind, almost as if he is looking at her, spying on her a little bit. I think this is pretty good for our scene itself. So now we can start working on some textures and some lighting and all that good stuff, and then we can work on the camera movement. The first thing I'm gonna do to see our textures and all that stuff is I'm gonna take my mouse and I'm taking up into this little corner up here. I'm just gonna click and drag so we can get like a split view. So we can use one of them to see what our textures actually look like in a rendered view, and the other one will just be our clay view, which is a little bit easier to work with, that we can move around. Another thing I'm gonna do is add a camera just so we can see it from the angle of the camera, just to make sure that the lighting looks the way we want in the position that we have it. So to do that, I'm gonna hit Shift A, and then I'm gonna go down into camera and just add a camera. Now it's gonna be all the way down here. So what I like to do is use one of them as a camera view, and then I'm just gonna go into the properties of the camera and set it all to 0. And then I'm just gonna drag it up so we can see it over here, and let's just rotate that around 90 degrees this way. And let's take this out a little bit, and we can take it down. We'll say that's pretty good. And then I'm gonna hit Control B, which is gonna bring up this little crosshair almost type of thing. And I'm just gonna click and drag only in the area where our camera view is. And all that it does is it selects a render region so that it only renders the details in that little square, which just makes it so much quicker. Now we have the render view here, because I clicked this little icon up here, and we have our clay view over here. And you can easily move around everything here, but this will only see what the camera sees. We kind of need to be able to see what we're doing, so we got to add some lighting. Now the good thing about the style, or at least what makes it a little bit easier, is that the lighting is super simple. We're going to go into world properties, and we can do a couple of different things. You can either set the color to a whitish color, which is just gonna give us a white background, some really smooth kind of shading almost. So it's not too difficult of a setup here. If we want to spice it up a little bit, and again, this works completely fine. But if you want to spice it up a little bit, in the color, the little yellow dot, you can click that and you can switch it to a sky texture. That's gonna give us a little bit more of a realistic sky. And we have a couple of different options here. We have these 3 different options. They all are a little bit different. The Nishida, however you pronounce it, is super cool. It's a lot more realistic, I'd say, which sometimes is super nice, but you can essentially control the elevation and all that good stuff. So you get some really, essentially realistic looking shadows, and you can play around with the rotation and all that good stuff. What I actually think that they use is one of these other ones like Preetham, which is a little bit more simplified, and you can control the strength to brighten it up a little bit and all that good stuff. But to control the direction of the lighting, you actually use this little circle here where you just click and drag, and you can kind of see how it changes in the circle over here, but also in the scene itself. I think something like this looks pretty good. And again, you want to play around with this to make sure you get the actual look that you want. But I think this will work pretty fine for what we have. Now, we do have one problem in terms of our textures, and that is this house over here, or our building, has way too much texture. We need it to be just a blank canvas. So I'm gonna go down into the material properties, and basically what we're gonna do is just remove all of these textures, and that's just gonna give us that clean look, almost kind of like an HBO intro type of thing. For our characters, we're just gonna click on one character, and it has this default little selected. What we're gonna do is just increase the metallic. Let's set it to 1, and you can already see it gives us that little bit of a shine. And then we are gonna decrease the roughness, which is gonna make it more shiny. Again, you can play with this to get the exact look that you want, but then go into the base color and just decrease the brightness a little bit to make it look a little bit more metallic. Now, if you wanted to give it a color instead, like let's say we want to give this guy a red color because we have to be aware of him and he's like dangerous, then we can pretty much do the same thing. So if we go in here and select the color that we already did for this lady, we can make a copy of it by clicking this little icon here, which is essentially just going to duplicate it. And then we can change the color to maybe a reddish color as such, and maybe increase the brightness just a little bit, so that there's just a little bit more focus on him, and we kind of know maybe he's dangerous, as I said. So that's a fun way you can kind of play around with it. And of course you can decrease the metallic if you don't want him to be metallic, but more of a clay color. And a fun one we can play around with too is the emission, which we might add, because if you look at the Imperial style, he'll oftentimes have this curved spline type of thing going through his scenes, which is actually super easy to create. All you got to do to create that is hit Shift A, and then you want to go into curve, and you can create a Bezier curve. Now it's going to be all the way down here, so I'm just going to hit G and Z to bring it all the way up here, and I'm just going to move my camera up. Then we're going to hit Tab, which is going to enter edit mode. I'm just going to select this one point here, and then I'm going to go down to my curve pen tool here, and we can just draw whatever we want really. And this will all be in 3D space depending on the your angle of the camera and all that good stuff. So you can play around with this and create some really fun shapes. But once you're done with creating your shape, you just want to hit Shift, and then you can hit G, and you can put it around exactly where you want it to be. But let's put that thing right here. We don't see it over here at all because it's just kind of like this little string. So if we select it, we can go into the properties of it, and then we can go into geometry, and then we just want to increase the depth of it down in the bevel. And this just depends on how thick you want it. You can make it however big you want, really. And then you want to select fill caps. If you don't select the fill caps, what you'll get is just basically an empty tube, kind of like a cylinder. So we want to close that off and make sure that that looks pretty nice and neat. And as you can see, it's pretty jagged. So we can go into our modifiers and add a subdivision surface, and then increase that to just be 2 is fine. And you can see that smooths it out really nicely. Then to add that color to it, we can go back into our material properties. You can start by just adding the one we added to the guide, but making a copy of it. And then in the emission, you want to change the emission color. So you can increase it all the way up, make it really bright, and then change the color of it to, let's do a reddish color. And you can change the emission strength, and you'll see how that kind of affects it a little bit. And if I then go over here, you can see it slightly reflecting in our background or in our floors as well, especially if you take it out here. Let's put it out in front of the lady where you can really see it, and you can accentuate that with the emission strength. The more you have it up, the more it's gonna glow and light up the room. So it just kind of depends on the look you're going for. You can see some really nice illumination over here, and I just think it looks super cool. We can even animate this. In most of his, they aren't animated, but I think it would look just a little bit cooler if it was, especially just as just a little detail element. But to animate it, we're just gonna, you can uncheck the path animation, it's not too important. You just wanna go to start at end mapping. So at frame 0, all the way down here, we are going to set the end to 0, or the start, whichever one you want, really. You just want to make sure they start at the same number. And then you want to keyframe the end, and let's go forward to 100 frames, and then we'll just set it to 1, and keyframe that again. So now if we play that back, we get a nice little animation here where it just kind of snakes around, super smooth. That's pretty much it for the textures, the elements, and all that good stuff, except for maybe one thing that we can add, and that is some text. Now, I don't know how to animate text in Blender like I do in After Effects, but I do know that you can take animations from After Effects and put them into Blender. You can create your stuff in After Effects, and then you can import them into Blender as a transparent file, and then you get the depth of field, the camera movement, the tracking, but made super easy, so you don't have to cut out things later on and do camera tracking in After Effects, etc. The way to do that is simply go into After Effects. I just have a 1920 by 1080 composition set up at 24 frames per second, the same as we have in Blender, technically 23.98, as you can see down here. And all I'm gonna do is just add some text. I'm gonna go to my text tool, and let's click that, and let's type in influencer. And I'm just gonna keep the font super clean. I like to have vertical font, you know, works super well. Make sure that text is center aligned, and I'm just gonna center that up. With the text centered up, we can start adding some animations, and like their style, I just wanna keep it super clean. One thing I did see that they had was this super smooth little position animation, and I'm just gonna open up my text, go into the text properties, add an animation property, and we're gonna select position, of course, because that's what we're trying to do. And then I'm just gonna slide it out to the right a little bit, and then I'm gonna open up the range selector, and at 0 seconds, or right at the beginning, I'm gonna keyframe the start, go to about 1 second, and slide it all the way to 100. And that's just gonna give us 1 by 1 letters coming in. We might even extend it just a little bit more, like that. Then another one we're gonna add is an opacity property, and we're basically gonna do the same thing. We're gonna set the opacity all the way to 0, keyframe the start right at the beginning, go to the end where the keyframes line up, and then set that to 100 as well. So now as they come in, they slowly fade in, so we just see one letter at a time. And I'm gonna add motion blur to this because that is something I picked up along the way, and we just get this super smooth little position in type of thing. I'm gonna stretch it out just a little bit so it's not super hectic. We can add a little bit of easing to it by selecting keyframes. You can go into flow if you have that and just adding some sexy speed, some super sexy speed in, whatever you want. You can really play around with it. These flow presets are available on my Patreon as well, by the way, just if you're interested. So playing that back, we just get this nice little slow, pick up the pace, and then come in type of thing. And I'm also going to add an out animation. So at about 4 seconds, we are just going to animate it out. And to do that, it's going to be a super simple position animation. I'm just going to hit P to bring up the position, keyframe that, go forward about 12 frames. And then I'm just going to drag it down a little bit. And I'm going to select the super sexy out animation, which is just a super steep curve. And I'm going to trim the layer right here. So I'm going to hit Option and right bracket. And I'm just going to drag this last frame in because it does do 1 frame past that. So now we have this super simple animation, stays on there for just a little bit and then animates out. Now we can end the composition right here because we don't need it to be longer than that. So just hit N to end the composition. You can right click and trim comp to work area. You should pick the color that you want for it in here. So in this case, I'm just going to set it to white. Always make sure you save, and then we can export this as a ProRes file. You can go into composition, add to render queue, and then in the output module, you want to select QuickTime, and then in the format, you want to select ProRes 444, which is going to let you export it as a transparent file. And then in the channels, you want to hit RGB plus alpha, and that just means that you export it as a transparent file. So super important steps: ProRes 444 and RGB plus alpha, and then you can pick whatever you want to export it to. With that exported, we can go into Blender once again. In here, now to get the setting, you do have to enable something. So you have to go into Edit, go into Preferences, go into the add-ons, and you want to make sure that you have the images as planes enabled. And this is already in Blender, it's just not activated from the beginning. So you want to make sure that this is enabled. With that enabled, we can hit Shift A and we can go into Image and then Images as Planes. Now it's going to bring up this folder and you just want to navigate to where you have it saved. And then I just named it influence text.mov. And over here you can change some of the settings. You can also change that later on in the shader settings of the clip itself. But you might as well just do it right now. You just want to make sure that everything looks good. But for the video file itself, you'll want to make sure that use alpha is checked and then change it to pre-multiply. This is the standard when you export from After Effects. Of course, if you do have it exported as a straight alpha, you want to make sure that it's still enabled. It just changes how it reads the alpha of it. So you want to make sure you match it, especially if you're using glows or shadows or anything like that. But outside of that, you can just hit import images as planes. So now you see we get it down here all the way at the bottom. Again, hit G and Z to bring it all the way up, and G, Y to bring it out to the front. And let's just take it down just a little bit. Now let's go forward a little bit here, so we should be able to see it. As you can see right here, I'm gonna hit S over here to scale it up a good bit. We can start placing it wherever we want. So I'm gonna take it back just a little bit, so it's kind of behind this lady here, over here somewhere. I'm gonna hit R to change the rotation of it just a little bit, kind of face it that way, and move it over just a little bit. Now it can be a bit hard to see, and we can always change this around a little bit by going into the material properties, and you can change the emission. If you just set that to a white, then you'll get a little bit more of that, and you can increase the emission strength, which is just gonna brighten it up a good bit and just add a little bit of ambience to it. As you can see, if we play it back, it animates in. It's a little bit slow playing back, but that's just what you gotta deal with when you do these type of things, and it animates back out, which is super neat. So now we have everything that we could possibly need in the scene outside of the camera animation. I'm gonna zoom out so we can see our full camera here. I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna select my camera, and I actually wanna start it at a little bit of a wider angle, so maybe a 35mm, and we can keyframe all of this, which is super sick. And we can add some punch-ins, some zooms, all that good stuff. I'm gonna start it at the very beginning, go down into our camera properties here, and I'm just gonna move it over just move it back and over just a little bit, maybe start it a little bit lower, rotate it a little bit more that way, so we get a nice angle on it like that, and maybe look up just a little bit. So I'm gonna keyframe all of this at the very beginning, keyframe focal length as well, because I feel like we should go up and zoom in. So let's do about 30 frames, so about 1 second. We can go up a little bit like that, and maybe angle it down just ever so slightly. And instead of moving the camera closer, we are just gonna increase the focal length a good bit to something maybe like a 75, so we get really nice and close to our little character in here. And then we can go back in and adjust it just a little bit, so maybe up this just a little bit and change the rotation of this just ever so slightly. and then we want to keyframe all of this once again. And it's very important that we keyframe it every time because unlike After Effects, the keyframes aren't manually or automatically done when you change something. Now this is our first little bit where we have this nice up and zoom kind of in, but now we need to keep it moving. So let's go forward a little bit and we're just gonna do a slight rotation. So at 140 frames, let's just go into our properties in here, and I'm gonna rotate the camera a good bit so we get almost like a full rotation here, like such, and keyframe all of that once again. And now we have the super smooth motion where we kind of come in and rotate around a little bit and have that moving in. If I turn this off, we might even be able to see it just a little bit quicker. So we have this nice zoom in here, we come in, turn around, kind of reveal that stuff. By default, the keyframes of these have some easing, and one thing you can do is, which I think would be a lot easier than to work with it in Blender, is just to set it to linear, set everything to linear, and then you can time remap everything in After Effects. And this just depends on your comfort level, so do whatever you feel comfortable with. Sometimes the manual easy or the automatic stuff they have in here looks pretty good. That would be one way where you could really finesse the keyframing of it just a little bit. So keep that in mind as well, that sometimes it's a little bit easier to do that in After Effects. There is one thing I feel like we're missing, and that is some depth of field. Now if we go into the camera options again, and then we go into the viewport display, we can turn on a bunch of different settings for the camera. One thing I want to turn on is the limits, and that's just going to give it this little crosshair here, which as you can see on the screen is basically just our focal area. Kind of like in After Effects where we have that pink line that shows where our camera focuses. This is it, but in Blender. So we're going to go to the very beginning, which is at our first keyframe here, and we're just going to go up, and we have to decide where our focal depth of field area is going to be. Now you want to make sure the depth of field is obviously turned on, and you can change the f-stop, you can lower it, you can set it higher, lower like 0.9 will be more depth of field, higher like 5 will be less depth of field. And you can play around with that depending on the type of look that you're going for, the type of vibe. I think 1.2 usually works pretty well. It also depends on the scale of everything, because if everything is small, your depth of field is going to be a lot shorter between different things. And then blades, I like to set it to 8 just because that kind of simulates like a real camera. I don't know how much of an actual difference it makes, but I like doing it. But then we're just going to change the focus distance here. Now, as you can see, you can select an object, but I like to manually do it just because I can pick exactly what I want to be in focus. So let's say this lady is in focus at first. We're going to keyframe that. Boom. We're going to go forward to where we have it kind of zoomed in, and I want to make sure that she is still in focus here. So we're going to add another keyframe, and then we're going to go forward, and let's say right about here, we're going to add another keyframe where she is still in focus. Boom. And then I'm also going to keyframe the f-stop here, and then we're going to go forward to where the animation ends. And this time I actually want our guy to be in focus. So we want to make sure he's kind of lined up with the focus plane here, and then stop that down a good bit. So something like 0.1. So now it's only him that's in focus. So now it's kind of like our story is going from, oh, there's this lady on a balcony, she's an influencer, and then there's this creep behind her, and then this bit will then go in to talk about her. As you can see, I forgot to keyframe that, but boom, there we go. So now we have him kind of, you know, being the focal point of it, because that's where the story's going, about how he's weird or whatever. This is a weird story that I'm bringing up, but anyways, it's just to illustrate the point. Now, as I said, we're gonna wait with the export settings until this very moment, which we're just gonna go into our output properties, and there's a couple of different ways you can export it in Blender. In this particular case, we do want to keep that background that the sky has for us, because we don't want it to be just a transparent background. So we can just go into OpenEXR, which is a really nice format, and you don't have to select RGBA, which would then be a transparent background. You can just go to RGB, and that works completely fine. So then you get the background that it kind of has for you. You want to change where it saves to, which is what you do right up here. By default, it saves to a temp folder. You just want to save that somewhere where you actually can find it again. And I like to select the codec to be a DWA8 or DWAB. I don't know the difference. I've just been recommended this. And that's pretty much it. And then you just want to go into render and render the animation, which will then render from start to finish. Now, our animation kind of ends here. So in theory, what you could do is change the end to 140 and then only render that unless you wanted this bit of animation for something else as well, where it's just kind of standing still. But that is pretty much it for how you can create these type of scenes that you see in the videos like Imperial or Lamino uses, or even Neo and Fan. Super simple, but works so well, especially with the stories, and they're not that difficult to do even if you aren't that well versed in Blender. With that out the way, I just want to say again, quick thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Make sure you head to the link in the description where the first 500 people can get 1 month free of Skillshare, where you can learn something new or even just get better at something you already know. If you want the project files for this that we worked on today, that will be available on my Patreon at patreon.com/Paul. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed this, and if you have any suggestions for what we should make next time, feel free to drop it down in the comment section down below. But that being said, I just want to say thank you, and I'll see you again pretty soon. Peace out.